Hello, everybody. I'm Ed Epstein, president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. Welcome to our regular October meeting and program. Today, we are very honored to have with us from the United Kingdom, from England specifically, Professor Richard Carwardine, author of the new book, Righteous Strife, How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. We will follow our usual format. We have our guest speaker speak for about a half an hour, and then we will have time for discussion, questions, answers, back and forth. Should be a very informative program. I'd like to add that the man I'm going to turn it over to, John O'Brien, our former president, has helped Professor Carwardine with his latest book. John is an active member of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., which was Abraham Lincoln and Mary's church during his presidency. And the pastor of that church, Phineas Gurley, was Lincoln's spiritual advisor during the war. So with that, my honor to turn this over to John O'Brien. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Ed. Professor. Richard Carwardine is a proud Welshman who was educated at Oxford and at the University of California, Berkeley. He did well enough to become the Rhodes Professor of American History at his alma mater and soon president of Oxford's Corpus Christi College. He is a fellow of both the British Royal Academy for the Humanities and the Royal History Society. Carwardine has devoted his academic career to understanding how Bible-believing Christians had profoundly shaped American politics in the early 19th century. His doctoral dissertation compared evangelicalism in Britain and America. His interest in the interplay of faith and politics continued with the book Evangelicals and Politics in Antebellum America in 1993. Beyond this, he shaped an original and insightful analysis of Abraham Lincoln's moral and political philosophy in Lincoln, A Life of Purpose and Power in 2003, for which he was awarded the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. And now finally we have Righteous Strife, his climactic work on how religion combined with politics in several powerful nationalistic visions that challenged Lincoln and drove the biblical ferocity of the American Civil War. Richard's career could have taken a wildly different turn. While a student at Oxford, he appeared in the 1967 film Dr. Faustus with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. He has continued to act and recently performed the title role in the play Cymbeline with the Abbey Shakespeare Players, a company in Wales he helped to found in 1980. In the midst of all this, Richard was also able to write about Lincoln's sense of humor in 2017, which received the ALI Book Prize. Though sadly, this American edition misspelled the title as Humor. This is the book in which Richard noted that among all the religious denominations, Lincoln preferred the Episcopalians because the frequently beset president considered that they were equally indifferent to both faith and politics. Richard Carwardine, welcome.
Thank you very much, John, for that very generous introduction, and thank you so much to you and to the Lincoln Group of DC for inviting me this afternoon. And I'm well aware that I'm probably standing between you and your lunch, but I'm standing between me and my dinner. I should just say I'm feeling pretty fit and chipper, but earlier today I had my COVID and my flu vaccines that are going to help see me fit through the winter. And if I start crumbling halfway through and losing focus, you'll know that it's not simply down to my mental weakness. I'm also, I have to say, struggling with a cough or a cold, but unlike internet viruses, this particular virus is not going to be spread across the Atlantic. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you too, John, for your little steer as to what has particularly interested your study group when you've been discussing my book. And I will talk for about half an hour, but I aim to go no longer than that. And I thought I'd begin by just fleshing out what you said at the outset about my work on evangelical religion, starting with my my Oxford research. I mean, I think you put the question, encouraged me to think about how my most recent book is a kind of capstone of the work that I've been working on research I've been doing for many years. And yes, I began work on American evangelicalism during my time at Oxford. I set out to study British and American abolitionism. But I soon came to see that the religious character of the impetus for reform was actually hugely important. And a couple of books that I'm sure your members will know. One is Gilbert Hobbs Barnes' The Anti-Slavery Impulse, 1830 to 1844. And Whitney Cross's study of the social impact of upstate New York religion, the burned over district, those were very influential works in steering me towards understanding evangelicalism. My advisor in Oxford, historian of Wesleyan Methodism, John Walsh, suggested the untapped research possibilities of transatlantic religious revivalism, because there was a steady two-way traffic of evangelicals which brought leading American revivalists to Britain throughout the 19th century, including the most influential Charles Grandison Finney. So my dissertation was eventually published as Transatlantic Revivalism and showed how American enthusiastic religion, common to Methodism and the Calvinist churches, fed an appetite among aspirational common people in Britain during the time of rapid industrialization. Oxford taught me to think about religion as a motor for political and social action, about undergraduate and graduate studies. And this has been a continuing theme of my research ever since. But I think looking back on it, a broader influence, what I probably didn't see at the time, was my upbringing in the industrial valleys of South Wales, with its strong chapel culture of dissenting Protestantism. And I'll just say a brief word about that. Most of the men in the typical village, the village where I grew up, which was typical of the valleys, worked in the coal mines. My father taught history at the local high school, but his father was a coal miner, and his mother boasted as her cousin, a miners' leader, John L. Lewis. It was a great discovery of mine. It was a heartwarming discovery of me to find that Lewis's tomb is about a few hundred yards away from Lincoln's tomb in the cemetery at Springfield, Illinois. Throughout the coal field, party political affiliations were liberal before the First World War, and later they were superseded by Labour Party and socialist trade unionism. And in religion, Protestant dissent from the Anglican Church remained vigorous in Wales until the mid-20th century, I should say. My relatives belonged to one or other of the nonconformist chapels of the Congregationalists, Methodists, and Baptists. My father was a Congregationalist and a great admirer of the Welsh social reformer and Liberal Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And so my father represented what was commonly known as the nonconformist conscience, a blend of radical religion and politics. And so by upbringing, I knew about the power of the nonconformist conscience and how religion can drive political engagement. Looking back, I think I can see how this influenced my reading of American politics before the Civil War. Evangelicals and Politics in Antebellum America, as you point out, John, is a book that argues that evangelical Protestantism, which was the nation's major subculture, helped to frame party politics. And I argue that, of course, I'm not alone in doing this, that church divisions heralded and aggravated the sectional split over slavery. The book is sympathetic to the so-called ethno-cultural historians who connected political allegiance to religious identity. I also really want to acknowledge here the encouragement that I got from the late William E. Gannap, a very good friend, fellow student of mine, a friend at Berkeley in 1970, a brilliant historian of the early Republican Party, whose career at Harvard was cruelly cut short in his prime. And in this book, I looked at autobiographical accounts, journals, and correspondence of individual ministers and lay leaders to show, along with much else, of course, how anti-slavery Whigs and subsequently Republicans won the support of key groups of mainstream Northern evangelicals. Well, the route from studying evangelical Protestants to writing a biography of Lincoln, who wasn't, may not seem obvious, but one of the aims of the book was to explore Lincoln's ethical thought and to show how tenaciously he stuck to his meritocratic faith, his belief that no one's opportunities for self-improvement should be limited by their class, their religious beliefs, or ethnicity, his repugnance for slavery, his unwavering commitment to a union freighted with moral value. And Lincoln's moral understanding of the uses and burdens of power was, of course, not founded on a conventional Christian faith, but the evolution of his religious thought, his Calvinistic frame of reference, and the ease with which he rooted his arguments in Scripture make it essential to take his religion seriously. And I'll return to this shortly. The second aim of the biography was to show the key sources of Lincoln's power, including his relationship with evangelicals. He harnessed the power of Orthodox Protestantism, the orthodoxy that fired the pre-war Republican Party and later much of the wartime Union coalition. Richard Strife therefore develops this theme, and it's been embarrassingly long in gestation. It began life as the Birkbeck Lectures in Cambridge University in 2004. I contracted it to Knopf, who took on the publication of my Lincoln biography and graciously took it on after it first appeared in paperback in England. And they said, well, they would rather like a book that they could take from manuscript through the press. So I said, well, I've got these lectures, the Birkbeck Lectures. How about that? They looked at them and they said, yes, that's fine. When can you deliver it? Oh, I said 2010. So, well, Knopf have been remarkably patient. My editor there said, she told me a story about two authors who, between them, were 50 years behind on their contracted dates, who submitted the manuscripts on the same week, in the same week. She said, as long as we know that you are serious about writing this book, we will remain, we're happy to honor the contract. And as you point out, my career meant, well, a number of things meant that I had to park that project. One was actually the bicentenary of Lincoln. I mean, when you write a book on Lincoln and you're running up to the bicentenary, one's life, my scholarly life was taken over by Lincoln and invitations to speak, writing essays, and indeed organizing a bicentenary event, the Global Lincoln, in Oxford. And then I became president of Corpus Christi College, and there wasn't time for heavy duty research, which is when I wrote the short book on Lincoln's sense of humor. Righteous Strife, which I think your members have largely read, I won't spend a long time talking about it in summary, but I think if I could just sort of, I mean, my question was, how did communities of faith, Union communities of faith, meet the challenge of war and the fundamental political issues in play? And in summary, there are three salient themes, I think. The first was that the clash of competing claims about the nation's religious purpose, which were on diverging trajectories long before the war, that clash reached its head in the election of 1860. On the one side, there are the mainly evangelical, mission-focused, Puritan, anti-slavery nationalists of New England and the northern diaspora, who gave the new Republican Party its moral fervor. And opposing them were those holding to conservative, pietist, white supremacist, and pro-slavery variants of faith-based patriotism, of course, strongest in the lower north and the south. And they soldiered to keep the pulpit clear of politics and the state free of the church. Secondly, I bring to the fore the neglected clash, and I think it is a clash that has long needs to be regarded in a political context between anti-slavery and conservative religious nationalists in the wartime Union. And of course, I mean, just to remind you, I've got no profound or technical term definition of religious nationalism. I simply mean the fusion of religious purpose and nationalist vision, where religious and national identities are interwoven and mutually reinforcing. That conflict powered the war's political narrative from the shattered optimism of the summer of 1861, to the Confederate surrender and post-war Reconstruction. And in this binary divide among pro-Union nationalists, each side certain of its own righteousness, emancipators slowly gained the advantage, and the conservatives railed as they watched their precious world slipping away. And I wanted particularly to show, and this is why the book is so long, I wanted to show that these different nationalisms shifted over time under the pressure of wartime events, aligning in political harmony on certain occasions and pulling apart into new nationalist formations at others. Thus, conservative Unionists were at one with their Puritan counterparts in resisting heretical secession, but they broke apart as emancipation became an ever louder demand. But of course, events pulled in another direction too. Many theological conservatives who had once defended slavery came to embrace emancipation as the indispensable means of saving God's republic, the last best hope of earth. And the third purpose of the book is to place Lincoln within the cultural swirl and political milieu of Civil War religion. The crisis reshaped his own religious thinking. What he said about faith encouraged others to reflect on the Almighty's purposes. The trauma of war gave him a new perception of God, whom he came to see as an active force in history. This providentialist turn deepened the anti-slavery ethic that had animated his political rhetoric during the 1850s. Then, in the 1850s, the beneficiaries of his Republican program to contain the wrong of slavery were to be the white settlers of the Free Soil territories. But now, a more capacious moral framework led him to embrace emancipation, a new birth of freedom, and equality of civic opportunity for both black and white. So that's a kind of intellectual autobiography and the summation in the Righteous Strife. And I'll go on talking unless there's something coming up on your chat that means that people want to interrupt me, John. But I think the second big question I want to look at, because I think you say there was still some skepticism about the sincerity of Lincoln's faith. I know you are satisfied by what I described, but some say some of the commentaries suggest that, you know, look at the memo, look at the response to Peter Cartwright, look at the fact that Lincoln is really recognizing the political power of religious faith, and doesn't that suggest, in fact, political expediency? Well, we don't have a window into men's souls, and I try not to do that in the case of Lincoln in the book, other than using what he himself says, on what we actually know and can determine about Lincoln. We know that the very young Lincoln attended his parents' Christian church in Kentucky and Indiana, but this experience left little imprint on him as a young man. The claim that while in New Salem, Lincoln verged on atheism is beyond proof, which is what what the groomsman at his wedding asserted. Certainly, he was drawn to Tom Paine's Age of Reason and the works of other deists. He was attracted by their rationalist critique of the scriptures. But this skeptical view easily embraced belief in a creator who was not quixotic or impulsive, but a maker who was a remote figure who stood back to let his creation run as clockwork along lines predictable by science and reason. And as we all know, this made Lincoln vulnerable to Peter Cartwright's charge of infidelity during the campaign of 1846, to which he had to make a kind of scrambled reply. And a reply, actually, which says very little, other than that he's conscious of the feelings of Christians. What should we make of Matheny's claim that Lincoln, of course, rented a family pew in the First Presbyterian Church? Lincoln played a sharp game on the Christian community, duping pious voters into believing he was a seeker after salvation in the Lord. Well, again, there's no definitive answer. My own sense is that Lincoln, during the 1850s, leaned towards Unitarianism. thanks to Billy Herndon, he read William Ellery Channing and Theodore Parker and admired their liberalism and rationality. Jesse Fell, a Bloomington Unitarian lawyer who had repeated conversations with Lincoln on religious subjects, argued forcefully that during Lincoln's Springfield years, quote, while he held many opinions in common with the great mass of Christian believers, he did not believe in what are regarded as the orthodox or evangelical views of Christianity. His religious views were eminently practical, Fell insisted, and are summed up on these two propositions: the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. I'm told that when Eisenhower frequently used that formulation, the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God, journalists wrote it down in shorthand as fog bomb, the acronym fog bomb. Whatever the faith that infused Lincoln's moral understanding, we can say that ethical clarity, stunning ethical clarity, characterized his response to the Nebraska Act, which opened the territory up to slaveholding settlers. Lincoln, of course, no abolitionist radical, nor did he share the orthodox Protestantism of the Republican Party, as I've said earlier. But in his speeches from 1854 to 1860, he established himself as a moral as well as a political arbiter of human enslavement, blending elements of Protestant conscience with Enlightenment rationalism, natural rights philosophy. His strikingly radical speeches at Galesburg, Quincy, and Alton, the climax of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in October of 1858, were in effect political sermons. Lincoln, no admirer of revivalist preaching, but he captured the moral earnestness of a Calvinist minister, shining a bright light onto Douglas's ethical murk and urging the claims of good over evil. I mean, he sometimes deployed scriptural language to sustain the natural rights principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration's principles, he said, were inspired by truth and justice and mercy and all the humane and Christian virtues. But, the political crisis, the upheaval that Lincoln faced as president, profoundly shook his settled pre-war theology. The trauma of war gave him a new perception of God, whom he came to see as an active force in history. This providentialist turn deepened the anti-slavery ethic that had animated his pre-war political rhetoric and led him to embrace emancipation, a new birth of freedom, and eventually equality of civic opportunity for both black and white. Even as he made his way to Washington in February of 1861, he declared that in its present extremity, the nation depended on God's guidance and support. Before then, he had rarely spoken of Providence as the shaper of the Union and its course, or of the Almighty as a judge of national righteousness and wrongdoing. He struck this chord in a poignant address as he left Springfield. But the clearest evidence of Lincoln's intellectual wrestling is in his meditation on the divine will. Probably, as you argue yourself, John, September 1862, your analysis of this document is just superb. And I'll read it out. I mean, it's one I've read so many times that I think I could probably do it without actually having to read the text, but I will stick to the text a little bit. And it's just mesmerizing, I think. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet, the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful sentence. And a very important sentence, as you point out, John. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true. Isn't that wonderful? So Lincoln's sort of caution. It's not quite equivocation, but it's Lincoln's caution. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. by his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants. This is not the God who stands remote in history, but a God by quiet power on the minds of the now contestants. He could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Yet the contest began. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. It's a remarkable document, and I don't think we should read this as the means of his stating something in public that will have mere public impact. He's writing it as a way of resolving his own questions, resolving his own faith. And equally revealing, or if not equally revealing, certainly very revealing, is Lincoln's meeting with the deputation of Chicago ministers in the same month, September 1862, who came to press the case for emancipation. And he told them, oh, for months I've been tussling with the question. I'm approached with the most opposite opinions and advice, and that by religious men who are equally certain that they represent the divine will. But one or other set of beliefs must be mistaken, possibly both. And when the Chicago visitors remarked that, nevertheless, the truth was somewhere, and that they appealed to the president's intelligence and faith in divine providence, Lincoln replied, unless I am more deceived in myself than I often am, it's another lightness of Lincolnian touch, it is my earnest desire to know the will of providence in this matter. And if I can learn what it is, I will do it. But, he continued, I hope it will not be irreverent for me to say that if it is probable that God would reveal his will to others on a point so connected with my duty, it might be supposed he would reveal it directly to me. Since there were no longer the days of miracles, I suppose it will be granted that I'm not to expect a direct revelation. Only from plain physical facts could a wise and right course be calculated. And then there is Lincoln's second inaugural address, a work of theological humility that cast the Almighty as a mysterious God of judgment who intervened in human history to punish national offenses. Lincoln surmised that the devastating war had been the price the whole nation, North and South, had to pay for their joint complicity in the sin of slavery. And he knew he was taking a calculated risk when he did this. Now, for those who think that Lincoln's public expressions of faith serve political expediency and tells us nothing about his private beliefs, and are not persuaded by the evidence of the meditation on the divine will, or by the second inaugural, then here is my riposte. Shortly after delivering his second inaugural, he wrote privately to fellow Republican Thurlow Weed, confessing that he expected the speech to wear as well as, perhaps better than, anything I have produced, but I believe it is not immediately popular. Men are not flattered by being shown that there has been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them. Key sentence coming. To deny it, however, in this case, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. This is a private document to Thurlow Weed. In words that put himself to, he continued, in words that put himself to in the moral dock, he continued, it is a truth which I thought needed to be told, and as whatever of humiliation there is in it falls most directly on myself, I thought others might afford for me to tell it. So that's my analysis of Lincoln's faith, which I've tried to do through his own statement. There are a number of other statements I could have invoked, but I think those are the key ones. Then there are two more areas of discussion that you raised, John, and I'll be very brief with the final one. But let me just take the third one about the conservative religious nationalists and the extent that they were more interested in contesting the end of slavery, constitutionally protected slavery, or the presence of free blacks. In other words, they were more interested in the race issue rather than in religion. And then you had a question: what about, was there anyone who believed in a truly integrated society outside the African American group? And you say, do I believe that Lincoln's April the 11th speech at the White House was a significant statement that he was going to lead a social change during Reconstruction. Well, I say briefly, conservative religious nationalists continued throughout the war to endorse the constitutional right of the white people of the slaveholding state. Their principles honored the family, white manliness, localism, the rights of the states, and resistance to Puritan autocracy. Racial issues had a key place in the agenda of conservative nationalists and were central to the polemics of Copperhead insurgents in particular. But conservatives' racial certainties also enjoyed the ethical underpinning of what they deemed the orthodox pro-slavery reading of Scripture. If Catholics were less invested in the notion of a transcendent American providentialism than their Protestant counterparts, they all voiced Christian arguments to denounce the Puritan fanatics that they held responsible for the bloody course of the war and expressed their utter mystification that anyone calling themselves sound Christians should fall for what they dismissed as the unscriptural nonsense of racial equality as spouted by the abolitionists. And Exhibit A in my case for taking the religion of conservative religious nationalists seriously is Clement Vallandigham. He's a major figure in Righteous Strife, appears on the front cover opposite Lincoln. We normally think about Vallandigham as a leading peace Democrat, not as a religious figure. But Vallandigham, of Huguenot ancestry, was raised in Ohio by a pious Scotch-Irish mother and a strict Calvinist father. His brother James followed his father into the Presbyterian ministry. Clement chose law and politics, but the influence of his Christian upbringing persisted. In 1854, at Dayton's First Presbyterian Church, he experienced what he described as a peace and joy which the world never gave, and which, God be praised, I feel and am assured it cannot take away. Naturally austere, he embraced a high Calvinist doctrine of the absolute sovereignty of God's electing love and the utter depravity and helplessness of man. He resisted the optimistic post-Calvinist belief of evangelical reformers that society would be perfected before Christ's 1,000-year reign. He erected an altar in his home and told his mother that morning and evening sacrifice shall daily be offered up so long as I do live. And I feel as if by God's grace I were able now to do some good truly in the church and the world. This was not a passing phase. His earnest wartime speeches quoted purposefully from the scriptures. Belief in his personal destiny under God's guidance made him resilient against attack. A long-term political supporter attributed Vallandigham's moral courage when faced with the worst, his military arrest and banishment, to a firmly seated religious conviction that God ruled the world and provided for the ultimate triumph of the right. This explained the amazing energy and unswerving faith of a steadfast states' rights peace Democrat. And similar religious certainties underpinned the Copperhead polemics of, for example, James McMaster, Presbyterian turned Catholic, the former chaplain of Congress and Iowa Methodist preacher Henry Clay Dean, Dirty Dean, and they colored the thinking, of course, of war-supporting Democrats. It's essential, I think, to see how the racial views of white religious nationalists spanned a broad spectrum from out-and-out white supremacist ideology to a pioneering racial egalitarianism. The egalitarians included standout progressives like John G. Fee and Gilbert Haven, something of a hero of mine, Gilbert Haven. True democracy, Haven declared, would not arrive until, and I quote, until there shall be no school to prepare white men to rule colored regiments, but such regiments shall be abolished, and men without distinction of color rule and serve in all the armies of the Republic, when there shall be no white nor colored churches, but all in Christ shall be one in Christ. Heaven had no illusions. Fraternity, the oneness of man, is yet an unsolved problem in this land, he grieved. Our hearts still hate our brothers. Still we thrust them from our arms. We must conquer our prejudices, or God will again cast us into weakness and agony. And like, for example, George Barrell Cheever, another radical, Haven's work for absolute racial equality meant working realistically with the grain of electoral politics alongside those who fell far short of his high standards. And the experience of war effected profound changes in racial outlook, not least among the white soldiers and seamen who began with prejudicial views, but came to marvel at the valor, integrity, fervor, and intelligence of the black troops who joined them in the cause of the Union. And Lincoln, of course, falls into this category. Recall the campaigning politician of 1858, who spoke of the physical difference between the white and black races that would forbid their living together on the basis of perfect equality. And recall the president who in August of 1862 faced the lash of Frederick Douglass's tongue for telling a group of African-American leaders that the logic of white race prejudice meant that separation and voluntary colonization was the answer. And then contrast this with the language of his letter to James Conkling in September 1863 to be delivered to an election gathering in Springfield that would certainly contain many anti-emancipationists and white supremacists. Looking ahead to the post-war reckoning, Lincoln said that victory would have proved that in a democratic republic, there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. But beyond that, this is the summation, the culmination of this speech. There will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind onto this great consummation. Yet he continued in fierce reproof, I fear there will be some white ones unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they had strove to hinder it. John, you mentioned you point to the speech of Lincoln's speech of the 11th of April, 1865, which of course was his opening position in the debate with Congress and with his fellow Republicans about Reconstruction. And it's clear from this that he saw that the two categories of African Americans had earned the right to the vote. The very intelligent, he was thinking, of course, of the free blacks of Louisiana, and those who serve our cause as soldiers. And although a mere 12,000 voters in Louisiana had sworn allegiance to the Union, they had, he said, adopted a free state constitution, opened public schools equally to black and white, and education was so important for Lincoln in preparing citizens for citizenship, and empowered the legislature to give African Americans the vote. In the light of this, to spurn the Louisiana initiative meant to say to the freed people, this cup of liberty, which these your old masters hold to your lips, we will now dash from you. Lincoln said, grant that the colored man desires the elective franchise, will he not attain it sooner by saving the already advanced steps toward it than by running backward over them? Well, Lincoln ended this, as you know, the last public address of his life with these words: in the present situation, it may be my duty to make some new announcement to the people of the South. I am considering and shall not fail to act when satisfied that action will be proper. So was he moving in a more conservative direction, as Charles Sumner feared, or in a more aggressively radical direction that would have put him on the side of the congressional minority who wanted full suffrage for freedmen and the confiscation of rebels' land? Well, we don't know. What I can say is that Lincoln had political mastery. He knew that in his second term, should he live, his health was not good, but should he live, he knew that in his second term, he would have an absolute command of his party. The victor of having reunited the country, having seen the end of slavery, having put his hand to the 13th Amendment, the passage of the 13th Amendment, and still of course going through the processes, he would have had enormous power. And there's no doubt at all that what he wanted was to see a modest progress towards the full citizen for blacks. I'm sure of that. The speed at which it would happen and the checks on its progress would be a matter of political discussion and debate. But I'm absolutely sure that Lincoln was not a stand-pat conservative. finally, your fourth point, and I'll be very quick about this, because you said that when in discussing the book, almost inevitably, the readers were sort of drawn to the current American Christian nationalism, and of course I do, in a way, invite a bit of that in my epilogue. My epilogue is rather, sort of saddened to see that some people seem to think that I've been a bit glib in my conclusion, and rather challenging. I thought actually my conclusions were rather statement of fact, but and I certainly intended them to be nothing more than kind of brief summary. However, that said, let me just make these points. I think there are some parallels, maybe even continuities, but some parallels between Christian nationalism then and now. And actually, your readers will be as equally, if not better, equipped to reflect on the current position than I am. But the parallels are that Christian nationalism, firstly, rests on a conviction of American exceptionalism, a chosen nation under God, specially covenanted, and a model for the world. Was true then, and it is true amongst many Christian nationalists now. It may be one of the defining features of current Christian nationalism. Secondly, Christian nationalists, whether Civil War emancipationists or today's Christians of Russell Vaught's persuasion, director of the Office of Budget and Management, they look to the use of the power of the federal executive to deliver a Christian reading of the Constitution and embed Christian principles in government. Third point, Civil War peace Democrats and today's liberal Christians fear federal coercion and the overreach of power. I'm not suggesting that Civil War peace Democrats and today's liberal Christians are ideologically similar, but that they find themselves both in the same relationship to the potential for federal overreach. And my fourth point about the parallels is that anti-slavery religious nationalists look to Lincoln as their vessel. Many wanted to see him declare an evangelical faith, but whether he did so or not, they believed that he was God's vessel for their program. In the same way, and this may seem a stretch, but I suppose it's the same, in the way in which MAGA religious nationalists see Trump, whose Christian credentials are not strong, see Trump as a vessel to achieve Christian purposes, and he's been likened, I suppose, by some to sort of Cyrus of Persia. The discontinuities, major one I would say is that evangelical Protestantism in the mid-19th century North, both anti-slavery and conservative, that nationalism bespeaks a powerful cultural confidence. They were the dominant subcultural force in the society, whereas today's conservative Christian nationalists are largely driven by fear of advancing secularism and the advance of non-Christian faiths. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Richard. There are so many wonderful phrases in the book. You express things so beautifully in many ways. I was taken by the Welsh inflection of your reading of the meditation. That was particularly meaningful. But with regard to the epilogue, there was a sentence there in the end, when white evangelical churches came to engage in political action once again in the late 20th century, their Bible-based faith and practice and their studied whiteness flowed in the cultural channels dug after the Civil War. A wonderful concept, beautifully expressed. But could you elaborate a little bit on that concept?
Well, yes, I suppose in a way, I tried to sort of elaborated in when I've talked about the continuities and the parallels. I mean, I don't for a moment believe that those who call themselves religious nationalists or Christian nationalists today see themselves as the heirs or inheritors of the Christian nationalism of the Civil War. But I do think that what the first century of the American Republic did was to embed a sense of America's exceptionalism. It embedded a sense of America being a chosen nation and a model for the world. It embedded the sense that American Christians had a duty to lead the way morally and socially in creating a better society. As I pointed out, the most aggressively liberal and progressive of the religious nationalists during the Civil War wanted to enhance the power of the federal executive to take on to establish emancipation. The pressure on Lincoln to issue an emancipation proclamation from those quarters, not as a war measure, but simply as an act of righteousness, was intense. Just as I think there's something to be, if you look at as I've not read the 900 pages of Project 2025, but I think what Project 2025 is stating is that we need to turn the federal government into an agency of moral reformation and reclamation. So that's a sort of an element of continuity. And I think there's I mean, when I say the channel's dug, I suppose I'm extending that to mean Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, when voluntarily Black and white churches separated. And we end with a situation where in early 21st century United States, churches are not formally segregated. And I don't mean to deny that there aren't many African-American worshippers in majority white churches and vice versa. But it is undoubtedly true that the most conservative of Christian nationalism is to be found in churches that are pretty exclusively white. And I say that's what I mean by the sort of channels that were dug. I don't mean to say that who am I to put a window into the souls of the conservative white nationalists, but some of the language that is associated with white Christian nationalists does seem to me to be pretty profoundly white supremacist, or at least sort of white dominant. I don't think that there's anything really similar to what we encounter in the Civil War, in the shape of the extreme peace Democrats racism, which is stomach churning at times. But I do think that the United States continues to suffer from, as a society, those challenges of racial acceptance that were sought during the Civil War, and which many thought had been achieved by the Civil War, but which sadly is not true, and that the reclamation, the reclaiming of the Confederacy in neo-Confederate circles is, I find, really rather troubling. So that's what I meant by all of that. It's an awful lot in one sentence, and I'm open to your correction on any of my perceptions, and I'm certainly open to the discussion with members of your group as to how far I've got that wrong.
I'm enjoying and learning, Professor. Thank you.
I would just say finally that I thought if I didn't say something about today, I'm not a believer actually in writing history to have simply as a means of finding a usable past. I am aware that writing of history does tend to, in some ways, reflect current preoccupations, or the preoccupations of a historian who is the product of his own society and his own culture, as I tried to say at the outset about coming from the Welsh nonconformity. But I don't think it is. I've always been an empirical historian. I've never set out with an ideological position to prove. My sympathies, my historical sympathies, but I try to do my best to honor all of the voices that I encounter, including, as I said earlier, the voices of the conservative Christian nationalists and the white supremacists, wanting to see the world through their eyes, which was that they were absolutely mystified that anyone could believe that 4 million Southern slaves could be regarded as the equal of the 26 million whites. I mean, this was a kind of preposterous perception, and they believed fundamentally that the scripture was on their side. So I'm trying to be sort of even-handed when I investigate the past, but I felt I had to make some kind of nod to kind of American history as a usable past. People would say, well, what do you think about the present? And so my key point was to say, actually, it's a very different world, and you can't draw, it's a serpentine route to the present, but that serpentine route follows certain channels that I think were actually established in the Civil War. So that's my rather long-winded and rather defensive answer.
Do you recall when you first became aware of Abraham Lincoln?
Yes. When I was a boy in South Wales, my parents wouldn't allow me to take the rather vulgar comics that the Beano and the Dandy, which most of my friends read, and I wanted to, and they said, well, you can't have the Beano or the Dandy, but there's a new comic called The Eagle, who I subsequently discovered was edited by an Anglican minister, by a minister of the Church of England. So it was designed to be uplifting and it's just encouraging the higher virtues. And every week there was on the back page an individual who was seen as and it should be an example to humankind. So you might have Winston Churchill, or you might have David Livingstone, you might have white missionaries. One of these heroes was Abraham Lincoln. So over several weeks, I read in comic form the life of Abraham Lincoln. I can't say that sort of planted the seed. I didn't say there and then, this is a man I want to spend the rest of my life working on. But that's where I first encountered him. I know my mother, who was no historian, my father was the historian, but my mother was the person who said, "Oh, Abraham Lincoln, what a great man! What a great man!" I don't quite know why she said that. I don't know where she got her ideas about Lincoln from, but I mean, Lincoln, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Lincoln the Emancipator. These were powerful forces in Wales in the late 19th and early 20th century, and Lloyd George was a great devotee, a great admirer of Lincoln. When he made his triumphal trip to the United States in, I think, 1923, he said the greatest day of his life was going to Lincoln's birthplace in Hodgenville and walking around his cabin and going down to the stream and drinking from the stream with cupped hands. And so it was it's an extraordinary homage from the greatest prime minister of the 20th century, some would say.
Your work has contributed greatly to our understanding of Lincoln. Your insights are amazing. This is the setup to this question. How have your views of Lincoln changed as a result of your research?
I think I'm now much more cautious than I was when I first started about Lincoln's being a Christian. I think, and certainly in the period before the war, I think in evangelicals and politics, I'm much too persuaded by my reading of William Woolf, and wanting to see a kind of sort of Christian element in Lincoln's personal faith, which, as you will have heard from what I was saying earlier, I don't see that there. Although I do see that he honored that Christian faith, and in some ways wanted to show that it was how congruent it was with the Declaration of Independence. But I think I'm much clearer now, not least thanks to a conversation I had with Don Fehrenbacher. It was a day in I think 1994 when I was beginning my work on the biography of doing my first visit to the Lincoln Archive in Springfield, and with the room was full of historians. The research room was full of, as I thought, historians. But in a break from my research, Tom Schwartz, who became a great supporter and friend, he said, it's a big day for the staff here, the archivist here, because they've got 2 historians in today. And I said, well, what are all the others doing? He said, well, they are all genealogists. But he said, it's you and it's Don Fehrenbacher. Oh, I said, well, I mean, the great Don Fehrenbacher. And Don had been the visiting Harmsworth professor when I was an undergraduate in Oxford in my final year. So I'd gone to all of Don's lectures, and I read his Prelude to Greatness, and great admiration for Don. And so we went out to dinner. He took me out to dinner at the Hilton in Springfield with his wife, and we reminisced on this and that. But his word of advice on Lincoln, he said, the great change is the Civil War. Lincoln really wasn't very religious before the war, but he becomes religious during it. I think I'd been feeling my way towards that, but I felt I had the endorsement of kind of the good housekeeping seal of approval, really, with that.
Excellent, thank you. We had a couple process questions. You cite sermons from all the different nationalist perspectives. How do you find all these this variety of material?
Well, over the years, when I began work on Lincoln with the Lincoln biography, I also thought at some point I want to write a book similar to Evangelicals and Politics in Antebellum America, about evangelicals and politics in Civil War America. So whenever I made a visit to a library, I would go scout. For example, I was at Princeton, the Firestone Library, in 1997 for the 200th anniversary of Charles Hodges' birth, and it was a terrific conference. And I'd been asked to write and prepare an essay on Hodges' politics, Hodge and politics, a fascinating subject. And but I had a lot of time during the week that I was there. And I went into the Firestone Library and found these, hundreds, as it seemed to me, of Civil War sermons, which I took to the photocopier and photocopied. This was well before the digitization program meant that then, more recently, I was able to go online for the Internet Archive, the Hathi Trust, the increasing numbers of websites that will give you access to the text of these 19th century sermons. So it's the difficulty has not been finding them, it's deciding when to stop reading them. You can get to a point with certain, I'm sure you know this yourself, John, you get to a certain point with a sermon, you know exactly what's coming next. But that's the answer. It's COVID was an ill wind in that it gave a lot of us time to read and to think and to write. And after years of delay on this project, 2020, 2021, 2022, I spent an enormous amount of time on screen, both writing and digging into this massive online material. And so there was no, that's the answer, the simple answer. I began in the stacks, in the archives. I took the stuff to the photocopier, not just the Princeton Library, but actually the at Wheaton College. Not Wheaton College, although some at Wheaton College, but at Garrett Theological Seminary next to Northwestern, as I had a friend. I have a very good friend in Evanston who would put me up for weeks at a time, and then I'd head up to Northwestern and to Garrett. And so the people were so kind, anybody, someone who is mad enough to want to read all this kind of sermonic literature and to read, various various incarnations of the Christian Advocates, the Western Christian Advocate, these Methodist newspapers, the New York Christian Advocate, the Methodist, the Western Christian Advocate, the Northwestern Christian Advocate, which are just terrific sources. They're just fantastic sources. When my wife, who's a historian of European history, when my wife went on archival trips to Geneva, which is a wonderful city to work in if you've got the budget for it, I would take reels of microfilm with me of sermons and of religious newspapers. You get a lot of some, as you well know, you get lots of sermonic literature in the religious newspapers and summaries of sermons. That's even better.
People are curious. Do you have a sense as to whether the Confederates had the same phenomenon? People writing to Jefferson Davis with these same concerns? Is that something you ever touched on?
It's not. I mean, I think Jefferson Davis, of course, he was baptized during the war. He was confirmed during the war. So Jefferson Davis didn't need to prove his faith in the way that Lincoln was constantly being urged to do. And for Lincoln, for many people, the test of his faith was moving towards emancipation. But another test of his faith was his declaring himself to be a born again Christian, which he never did. And constantly he's I see the correspondence to Lincoln saying, please, you've only got one little step to make. You're almost there. and Lincoln doesn't take that step. Jefferson Davis does. But I think people do. I mean, the problem for Jefferson Davis was that people really didn't warm to him personally. The one thing about Lincoln was that even those who denounced him as the Abraham Africanus and as the tyrant, underlying it all, as was clear after his assassination, many of those who'd been his bitterest critics, and not just out of self-preservation, said, actually, we recognize that he was a man who had integrity and lived by his values. And a sense that, of course, Lincoln had these, wonderful private public opinion bars, as he called them, where he would routinely meet every week with people who sat waiting to see him. He was enormously accessible to ordinary people, and that gave him a kind of sense of what the word was on the streets, what people were thinking, what people wanted. I don't think Jefferson Davis ever quite managed that. I don't know about the correspondence to Davis. I mean, it's not something I wanted to, but those are the sort of picture. That's the general picture I get.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes left. You're bearing up very well. Thank you. Yeah. The one prominent figure in your book you haven't talked about yet is Reverend Petroleum Vesuvius Nasby. You present that he had quite an impact on Lincoln. We've read about the humor, but you suggest it had a more profound impact on countering the peace Democrats.
I think that what it did, and let me say that I know many of your members will be at the Lincoln Forum, and I look very much forward to seeing them all there and perhaps engaging in one-to-one conversation. I was warned off by the great Harold Holter from repeating myself, and I think we've successfully managed that.
Yes,
we've successfully managed that. I can now go ahead with my preparation for the Lincoln Forum. I haven't yet written it, but I can assure you that Petroleum V. Nasby will make an appearance. I think what Lincoln loved about it was that it's as someone once said, it's the photographic negative of all that Lincoln held dear, of all that he was striving for, of all that he thought that the Union was about. This man embodied everything that the Union should not be. And while people north and south could probably agree about the drunkenness and the corruption, the fact was it was the moral code or the immoral code or the ethical code of Petroleum v. Naseby that was the exact photographic negative of everything that Lincoln stood for. And he just, Lincoln, as we know, Lincoln was just a failed satirist, the satirist who almost sort of put himself in a duel because he'd got it wrong, came to Naseby with just complete admiration. So yeah, I think it was hugely influential, but influential both in a literary sense and also I think in an ethical and moral sense, because Naseby codified everything that the Union should not be.
Thank you very much. We look forward to more of your comments in Gettysburg. Thank you for that. I invite everybody to unmute yourselves and let's show our appreciation for Professor Carwardine's talk with us today. You've been very generous with the time, and we appreciate your insight, your scholarship, and your friendship. Thank you very much, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I can see.
Thank you. And,
thank you. Look forward to meeting you at ALI in March.
Thank you for visiting us again.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. And I'll be I expect to be in Washington in next March, whatever date the ALI fix for the annual meeting.
March 23rd, Saturday, March 23rd.
March 23rd. Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's good to know. I was going to follow that up, but my diary, I've cleared the end of March in my diary. So I'm looking forward to it. It's been terrific. Thank you so much. And I can see some very nice nice comments from you. You've obviously, John, you've obviously paid people to say something nice. So thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. I'll see you all.
Richard, thank you.
See you at Gettysburg.
See you in Gettysburg.
Thank you.